Well, hello, Barnes & Noble Book Club. It's really good to see everyone, as always. I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over. I'm with Ann Patchett, the one and only Ann Patchett, y'all. And Shannon DeVito, my partner in all things books at Barnes & Noble. So before we get started, though, feel free to drop your questions in the chat. Feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A module at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I'm going to be keeping an eye on both of those. And if you dropped us a question when you registered on Eventbrite, guess what? I have those too. So we're going to work those in as we go along. So again, though, feel free, use the Q&A module, use the chat. I have your questions from Eventbrite. So if you already gave me your Eventbrite questions, don't worry. I have them in my hand, I promise. And more importantly, I'm so happy to see everyone. We're so excited about Tom Lake. This is such a great book. And I'm going to quote Anne for a second because happy families are underrated. So we're going to spend some time with a very happy family and a very great author. So before we really get started, Shannon, I know why we picked Tom Lake for the BNN Book Club pick, but why don't you bring in everyone else to the conversation so we can start there?
So besides me being in love with pretty much anything that Anne writes, when I was reading this book originally in its ARC format, I was so drawn in by the atmosphere and the feeling of really being wrapped up in a place, in a time where it felt like Laura's memoir, this oral history that's slowly unwoven in this beautiful, gorgeous way to her daughters as like a love letter to life, but also this tradition of oral history as a written word. And I knew there's, these beautiful nods to Chekhov and these all kinds of things that are direct references, but the references to just classic words in its purest form hit me so deeply. And the way it looks at motherhood and this idea of parents as people with full lives that sometimes children forget all the time, I think is just so important as a lot of families find each other again or decide to not find each other again. I think it just felt rather pitch perfect and comforting in the purest of ways. So I thought we had to have it for August Book Club. The timing was perfect. It's discussion worthy. It needed to happen. So that's why we selected it.
Thank you, Shannon. That's awfully nice of you.
Right, yeah. It's true.
Nice to hear a fellow bookseller too rave about a book that is an absolute must read. I mean, that is part of the fun of this. But Anne, I know you've done so many interviews in the last few weeks, but would you just sort of bring folks into how Tom Lake started for you? There's a very excellent story about a visit to a bookstore in Upper Michigan.
Yeah. So in 2001, I was on book tour for Bel Canto, and my publicist said, I want you to go to this little bookstore in Petoskey, Michigan called McLean and Aiken. And to get there, you have to fly to Detroit, take a commuter flight to Traverse City, rent a car, drive 2 hours, go to the bookstore, do a 4:00 event, and then do the whole thing in reverse and get back to Detroit by the end of the day. And I was not amused. However, I fell in love with the store, and I fell in love with the people that owned the store, the Norcross family, and they became really good friends of mine. My husband and I started vacationing there. When I was at the airport in Traverse City that first time, you could buy a little paper cup of cherries for $1. And I was not at that moment thinking, boy, someday I'm going to write a book about a cherry orchard and I'm going to set it right here. But these things get filed away in the back of your mind. And when I was writing The Dutch House, I had an idea that was really no more complex than I want to write a novel about a woman who played Emily in Our Town in high school. And then just kind of cooked it from there over a long period of time.
I have to admit, when I first started reading Tom Lake and I realized that we were in a cherry orchard in Michigan, my first thought was Chekhov.
Sure.
And you did, I will say, I went back and I reread Our Town for the first time as an adult. And yeah, folks, if you haven't done that recently, it's really worth it. You can certainly read Tom Lake without having read Our Town, but it adds quite a lot if you do. And then I'm just a huge Sam Shepard fan. And I have to say, I was very happy for the shout out for Fool for Love, because our Laura,
Laura.
I just Laura,
say Laura.
Sorry, Laura. Your Laura
You had to drop that L, that U.
I know. And I understand the U. I understand dropping the U, but come on, you've got her playing Emily in Our Town and May in Fool for Love.
That's so messed up, right?
It's messed up, but it's fun for you. Come on. So how did you land on Sam Shepard? I know you've always been a fan of Our Town, and it's something you've held very close to you as a writer and as a reader for a really long time, but Sam Shepard?
Okay, so, well, one, I love Sam Shepard. Two, I am a bookseller, so I'm going to work in recommendations no matter what I'm doing. But three, I have this great friend named Erin Whiting who lives in Traverse City, Michigan. Erin grew up on a cherry orchard, and after college, she started a professional theater company called Parallel 65. And she just answered questions. She answered all my cherry questions, all my farming questions, all my theater summer stock questions. So the Tom Lake portion of the book takes place in 1988. Man, you understand that you're not going to know anything about cherry farming, but the extent to which I didn't know anything about summer stock was also really shocking. So I didn't know you show up, you rehearse like crazy, and then pretty much the day your play opens, you start rehearsing your next play during the day, and then you're in your first play at night. So I got her to give me lists of what summer stock theater companies would have been doing in 1988. And one of the plays on the list was Fool for Love. And I just thought, oh, no sex, sex. Like, it's just like wholesome, hot. And how confusing that would be. And then also the idea of, just because you're fantastic playing Emily in Our Town doesn't mean that de facto you're going to be able to play May in Fool for Love.
Right.
It's about as far of a reach as you could get.
Shannon, I have a couple of years on you, and I have to say, I loved the bits set in Tom Lake. I mean, some of us may have had 20s that were slightly rowdy. And it was kind of nice to go back and visit, some of the terrible decisions you make when you're being rowdy and not thinking about, being an adult and all of that. And I had a really good time too, because the 80s were, it was a weird moment in the world and everything else. But Shannon, you still really were seated in the story. I mean, I remember talking to you about this in the office, and you were just right there. Like, you didn't feel limited at all in what you were reading. Yeah. And I love that. I really love that.
It felt more real because she was explaining it from her perspective. And I know there's this debate about what truly constitute historical fiction, which we won't get into. But
I'm sorry, but can we? Because
I do want to go there. I really want to go there.
My booksellers in Parnassus are saying, well, like The Girls by Emma Cline, it's historical fiction. And I'm like, what are you talking about?
It's a debate.
Nothing that I can remember is historical fiction.
Yeah, that's pretty much how I feel about it.
If you want to know what constitutes historical fiction, it ain't Tom Lake.
And it's not. And I wouldn't put this as historical fiction, but it is. It's just the perspective when you're not familiar still felt very real because it's coming from Laura's perspective. It's her spinning this tale, and it felt really rich because it was her holistic experience. And that's what I think the learning about summer stock, because I was not a theater kid. I enjoy theater and I read plays, but I was never a part of that. I was a band nerd. Let's be real. So learning about how that actually happened and the expectation and jumping into a role that you weren't prepared for. And then her realizing that, just her character development of her realizing that this is a part of her life that will be over now, because it was just this opportunity and it was a summer to make mistakes and be messy and just be messy in your 20s. And then it's really, that's not decade specific. That's just how old you are. You could do that in the 60s.
It's age specific.
It's ageless.
That's exactly right. Plus, I bet if we all packed off and went to summer stock theater next summer, it would be remarkably like this. I think
exactly.
Experience out of time. I mean, I think that theater is more inclusive now, but basically, I think it's still summer camp for adults.
Right. You're playing
without a doubt. Yeah, without a doubt. But it's also community building, and that really, that intense it mimics being a teenager so well. And okay, you could argue that being in your 20s is not that far removed from being in your teens, but at the same time, right? Like some of these players, like Duke, are a little older, right? They've been around a little bit, but yet that intensity and that momentum and that sort of that white hot moment you get when you're like, we're going to be friends forever. And then of course, real life intervenes. You captured that energy in such a fun way. And that's hard to do on the page.
And let me tell you, that energy, because I was never in summer stock,
right?
But I went to a lot of artists' colonies in my 20s. I went to Yaddo and MacDowell and those places. Same thing. You know, you're there to work. And maybe somebody gets a little bit of work done, but boy, the amount of sneaking between cabins in the middle of the night, it's really something. It really is like camp. And everybody's very intense and everybody is incredibly passionate about their art, and that passion bleeds over into other areas of life.
And it is. And I think the place that you're anchored in, because it doesn't feel like a home, it's kind of an escape, right? It's this separate from your everyday. But then Laura decides to kind of lean into part of that idol and that part of her life, which I just love. We can get to that, but it's anchored in the place. Yeah.
And that's when I think of Ann Patchett novels, even though, there are two things I want to sort of hit on while we do this. I sort of think of Commonwealth and The Dutch House and Tom Lake as a trio of novels that sit together as siblings. So you have such a broad body of work, but those are the three I sort of want to think about in the context of this conversation, because the way you're working with family, but also this sort of, it's not that people are stuck unwillingly, but the setting and sort of the compression of time and place and the fact that you're with people who are family, but maybe you wouldn't have necessarily chosen to be specifically with them. Like all of these feel like a hallmark of an Ann Patchett novel to me.
That's my rut, man. And I could try not to do it. I would say, this time I'm not doing it. And then I finish the book and I'm like, wow, look, there it is. Because you can't escape who you are as a writer. I always think I came into this world with 52 cards. And I can just shuffle and deal out different hands my whole life. But my cards are my cards. I'm not ever going to get 53. And I hope I'm not going to go down to 51. So, yes, it's very different. And I meet people all the time who say, oh, I've read all of your books and it's like they've been written by different people. And I think, seriously? Because it is sort of the same book in a lot of ways. And I don't mean for it to be, but again, it's me. That's what I got. I got me.
Which brings me to Emily and Maisie and Nell, these sisters that I am extremely fond of. Yeah. And Emily, there's a lot of teenage girl energy in this book. There's a lot of teenage girl energy. Some of it is recognizable, some of it isn't. But each of the girls is really they are their own person. They have their own relationships to their parents, but the one thing that they kind of do share is this idea that they know their parents' story and that their parents are in fact not really people. And I think, and I know I'm certainly guilty of this. I do not want to think about my parents' lives prior to my brother and I showing up on the planet and being because people, no, they're my parents. Like, what do you mean? Via lives and interests and
Didn't they just sprout from Zeus's head? Isn't that how that worked?
I thought so.
As a parent?
Honestly, I honestly, I thought so. But I do love this family. And I'm wondering, Anne, if you miss them at all now.
No.
Okay.
Oh, no. When I'm done, I never want to see these people again. I never think about them. There's this thing that you have to do when you finish your book. And I send it off to my friends one at a time, and my friends give me notes, and I read it, and I rewrite it, and I reread it, and I send it to the next friend, and I do that, and I do that, and I do that. And then it goes to the HarperCollins, and my editor reads it, and then the copy editor. And then you get into things called page proofs, where you have to read the book 3 times to look for typos, which typos are like lice. You think you've got them all, and yet, by gosh, there you find one again. So you're reading something that you know so well. You are trying to read it so slowly and so carefully to find the lice. And by the time it's done and they take it away and they say, you are never allowed to change anything ever again, I'm like, go with God. I don't ever want to see you. I don't ever want to see you again. And that's never changed. I've never looked back on one of my books and thought, oh, I really want to tuck back into Patron Saint of Liars. No curiosity whatsoever.
Was there a daughter or Laura or Peter or Sebastian or Pallas that you preferred to write? That you're like, oh, I'm excited to dig in more to how they're going to act in this situation because I like them, or they're fun to write. Or on the flip side, is there anyone you're like, oh, I got to do another perspective from?
No, I got to say, that was a really fun bunch of characters. And the secondary characters, I mean, writing Uncle Wallace, oh my gosh, it's just, what a breeze, what a treat. Every time he comes on, you know who he is. And I love the fact that he was a really good actor. You know, he was the overbearing drunk, but he was also a really good actor. Sebastian, I loved long-suffering Saint Sebastian. And I love the three girls together.
Yeah.
I love their dynamic, and how they're trying, you know, Maisie and Emily, Maisie and Nell don't want to set Emily off. But then other times it's like, I could care less if I'm going to set you off or not. I'm going to say whatever I want. And how they get each other to sort of snap back into line.
Mm-hmm.
That's a fun dynamic to write.
I think the balance all of the characters found with each other, whether it be the Laura and Joe dynamic or the three sisters or Seb and Peter, what was comforting about the book throughout it is that despite how messy things could get or how short they could get with each other, they'd snap back into this comfortable, important relationship, which was very refreshing as a reader of many depressing fiction books. It was nice to see them approach it from a healthy perspective and do things that, you know, at the time seemed like it was super drastic, but come back and for Laura to look back and say, no, that was the right thing for me to walk away. Or, you know, it's nice to see characters. That's why it was nice to spend time with them.
Yeah. And I don't know about you, but that really is the way it is with the people that I know. And you get to a certain point in your life you know people, you've known them for such a long time, and you knew them when they were kids, and now you know their kids, and their kids have grown up. And there's just a lot of decency out there. There's a lot of kindness. And when you look at families close up year after year after year, and they're people that you love, they do snap back. You know, they have their bad moments and their hard times, and somebody gets fired or somebody gets sick or somebody gets divorced, or, you know, but the family rallies and they come back together with a lot of love and, I don't know, just buoyancy. And I don't see that often enough in fiction. I see it constantly in my life, and I don't see it often enough in fiction. And I don't understand why it's considered idealized or sentimental or nostalgic if it's in a novel, but, you know, it's kind of everywhere, every day in life.
And Laura is not nostalgic. That's one of the things I really like about her as a character. She is not nostalgic about her past. She's like, I did these things. Some of it was cool. Some of it was weird. Some of it was whatever. But she's not steeped and lost in the sense of, oh, well, it was all so much better than kind of thing. She's like, yeah, I did that. And she's settled into this really lovely relationship that's long term. No one's throwing plates at anyone's head. Like, it is possible to be with your person long term without having more than sort of the everyday drama. And yet everyday drama can make a really satisfying novel. I think we need to hold on to that a little more.
I completely agree. Everyday drama is what we have. And it's okay, I'm going to take a turn here because a lot of what I think about, a lot of what we talk about at the bookstore is, who has the right to tell a story? And I have written so many novels that would not be okay now. Bel Canto, State of Wonder, not okay. Okay then, really good then, but not okay now. So I think about this, and I think about, all right, what if I have to draw on my own experiences, which I've never been interested in drawing on before? Maybe that's enough. And maybe there is something just kind of subtle and nuanced that you don't want to have to dig into and deal with. And so you have a tendency, I have a tendency as a writer, I had a tendency as a writer to look at other people's lives as more dramatic and more interesting. But am I just avoiding my own life? Maybe I'm avoiding being boring or being small, but then coming back to our town, it's the small moments for all of us that life is made of. So it's kind of just been an interesting journey.
I think there's also this idea for some critics, certainly, and even some readers, that in order for a novel to be wrestling with sort of like the big ideas of life, right? Life, death, all that kind of thing, it can't be domestic. That the domestic is somehow diminishing the conversation that we're having. And I'm like, but wait a minute, if all of us are doing some version of this, right? Domesticity looks different across, a million different layers, but at the same time, like, why are we so quick to dismiss it? We're not all dealing with ICBMs in our backyard, right? Like,
but I can tell you why.
Okay,
you're so quick to dismiss it, because it's primarily the story of women and women's lives.
There you go.
And if you go to war, that's really important. And if you make breakfast, that's really not important. And if there are people out there who feel that way, they are entitled to feel that way, and they are entitled to dismiss what I'm doing. But, women's work, women's lives, domesticity in fiction, that's a lot of what this world is about. And I'm fine with it. Call me whatever you want.
The other thing is, too, honestly, sometimes making breakfast is a political act.
Hell yes.
Right? Like, let's not, or the idea that people have feelings about whether or not women have children.
Yeah.
And what that means for your status as a human, whether or not you decide to have children. Like, it's fascinating to me. And that's part of what I appreciate so much about Tom Lake, is that I could sit in this world with this family, and for all of their sort of prickliness and foibles, they're still madly in love with each other in different ways. They still need each other in different ways. And it's not just because they're family with a capital F, right? Like, they actually do want to be around each other. They do actually appreciate each other as human beings. And that's really, could we have more of that, please? Could we have more of that? I think there's so much to be said. But Anne, do you have a favorite moment or a favorite sort of piece of this novel that you really just connected with early on, and maybe in surprising ways?
There's a chapter towards the end that is Laura's backstory and the story of her grandmother that's really short, that was really meaningful to me as somebody who loved my grandmother like I love my own life. That was it was a real pleasure to write that. And again, because it echoes in 5 pages, the whole book of how is it that this person that I was closest to in the world, and I didn't know the central story of her life. And then when Laura calls her own mother and says, how did I not know this? And she said, oh, it's just too sad. I just never talked about it. It was just too sad. And that's so true. Again, it's true. People say that all the time of men who went to war. My grandfather could never talk about being in the war. We understand that. We respect that. But to say, oh, this woman lost a child and she could never talk about it. And we're like, what? Why couldn't you talk about
yeah, it is the generational aspects and the transition between the generations, I think, were really lovely and graceful and smart. But
thank you.
It's funny too, because so many of us are kind of always looking for that, where's the conflict? Where's the and sometimes the conflict is very quiet.
Well, and also conflict is everywhere.
Yeah.
The conflict is, this is a novel that's taking place during a pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a novel about how climate change is really going to affect this family and their decisions right now.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, whether or not they're going to get to keep planting cherry trees, and also whether or not they're going to get to keep having children. So the issues, and there are issues of women's right to choose. There are some very, very big things in this book that provide plenty of conflict. It's just they're not beating one another with bats.
Could you have written this book without the pandemic lockdown? I mean, the girls come home, they're all sort of established, they're in college or they're having their lives or whatnot. And also mom does say, hey, listen, we don't get to see each other that much. Can you please just put your phones down? And they actually do put their phones down. I'm sure some version of this could exist, but the story feels so organic in a way that sometimes pandemic novels may not necessarily work. And I'm wondering if you needed that container for this particular family.
Absolutely not. And here's why I know that. Because I was planning on this novel before the pandemic. Mm-hmm. I came up with this book during the Dutch House. Mm-hmm. And the reason that schools have summer vacation is not so that people can go to camp and later get internships. It's because this is an agrarian society. Yep. Children were needed to work on the farm. Yep. And so farm girls who are in college come home and work on the farm for the summer because that's how you pay your tuition. So no, this was always going to be a book in which the girls came home to pick cherries because that's what they do. Right. And then the pandemic rolled around and I was like, oh, but now they can't leave. So, I mean, it was an added layer, but the book isn't dependent on it. It makes them a captive audience. And I do love a captive audience.
I like reading about your captive audiences. I'm happy that I am not, or at least I don't think I am. I could be wrong about that. Shannon, what are you hoping book club readers took away from Tom Lake?
I think so. For me, it actually made me go talk to my mom and grandma more, which I'm sure which I try and do, but I think you do get so caught up in the day-to-day of, whatever form your life takes, it kind of takes a back seat and you don't think about the histories that really form who you are. There's this thread of who Emily's true father is throughout the book and how that nature versus nurture versus, being a product of your surroundings and what you choose to believe. I think really looking at where you're coming from and whatever that looks like from whatever walk of life you are and the people you've chosen to surround yourself with, whether that's blood related family or a family of friends that's a newfound family. I think that's the crux of this book for me, is really about establishing for yourself what it is that makes you who you are. Because I think it's because it's quiet in its conflict, there's this ability to have a reflection on who you are as a person and what your kind of, I see it as Laura kind of setting part of her history off to see, like, what would that look like for me? What would that look like for my mother? What would that look like for my grandmother? I think it kind of spurred those questions for me in a really effective way. And that's what I would hope other readers would take maybe a part of that away or a different thing. But for me, that's what I took. And I think that was the richest part of the read.
Thank you.
Meryl Streep.
Yeah, what about it?
Meryl Streep. We have lots of questions about how Meryl Streep ended up being the narrator for the audiobook, and a side question about Tom Hanks reading The Dutch House. So can we talk about bringing in someone to bring your vision to life? I mean, obviously, two of the greatest American actors possibly ever, and both do a terrific, terrific job, obviously. But at the same time, you are kind of letting your work go to someone else, and you got to trust that they're going to do the right thing. But there are folks asking how all of that came about. So would you be willing to share that story?
Sure. And I'll start with Tom. So I knew Tom when his book Uncommon Type came out. I blurbed it. I wound up doing an onstage interview with him in DC. We became friends. It's a whole long story, which is covered in These Precious Days. But I thought, as Tom Hanks would say, no pitches, no hits. You've got to at least try. So I wrote to him and I said, I don't think you're going to do this, but you were in a Miley Cyrus video. So I think, no, it wasn't Miley Cyrus. Who is the other girl who sings Call Me Maybe?
Carly Rae Jepsen.
Carly Rae. He was in a Carly Rae Jepsen video. And I was like, okay, I feel like I'm out of line asking, but you were in a Carly Rae Jepsen video. So, I mean, who knows? Who knows what you might say yes to? And he said, oh, sure. Yeah, that's great. He said, let me read the book first and see if I think it would be a good fit. And he read the book and he did it. And he did such a beautiful job. And what I loved so much about Tom's reading of that book is that it's funny. And I thought that book was funny. And nobody else thought it was funny, but Tom thought it was funny. Thank you.
No, I thought it was funny. Sorry, I have a little
Thank
brother.
you.
I thought it was funny.
And in his reading, it's so spot on. He's so funny. And so I felt all empowered. And Meryl has 3 daughters, and she just seemed like the perfect choice. But of course, she seems like the perfect choice for everything. So I had met her 15 years ago. We had lunch because there was a period of about 7 minutes where she was interested in playing Roxanne Koss in the movie of Bel Canto, and it didn't work out. But I knew that she would remember. And so my agent is Felicity Blunt, the sister of Emily Blunt, the wife of Stanley Tucci, who played the husband of Meryl Streep in Julie and Julia. And I wrote to Felicity and I said, could you get this to Meryl? I just wrote a really, really short description of the book, like 3 sentences, and said, is there any way you might take a look at this and see if it's possible? And she wrote back and said, oh, yeah, I'll do it. I'll do it. That sounds great. You're so nice to ask me. And I got to sit in on the first 2 days of the recording. And it was amazing. She's everything you want her to be. She's warm, she's smart, she's unbelievably professional. She's so hardworking. She never made a mistake. She never took a break for a sip of water. She could just go and go and go. And at one point on the second day, she was reading the scene where Laura and Emily are sitting on the beach and they're talking about burning the cherry trees. And I started to cry. Now, I am somebody who cries once every 5 years, and I cry about 4 tears. I mean, I am just, crying is not in my wheelhouse.
Respect.
And so when she finally stopped to take a break, I said, that was so embarrassing. You made me cry. Like, I wrote it. I knew what was going on and I cried. And she said, oh, don't worry about it. Sometimes late at night, I turn on the television and there's one of my old movies on and I'll start watching it and I'll cry. Like, I love you. I just love you so much. But it's so brilliant. And when people say, I listened to the book, I get so happy because, the audio is better. And the reason the audio is better is because the book is all of my talent, right? But then the audio is all of my talent with all of Meryl Streep's talent or Tom Hanks's stacked on top. It's just, there's no way that it can't be better.
I have to say, I mean, I do like audio for certain things, and there are times where I'm rereading when I'm prepping for a show, and the audio can just be a treat. And especially for me, when it's something I'm revisiting, it's like, oh, right. But to hear someone else's tiny bit of different spin, because obviously you have your own voice when you're reading and everything else. But audio can be a treat.
Let me say, I had just read Kevin Wilson's book, Now Is Not the Time
to Panic.
And like 3 days later, I was driving to Memphis and I had downloaded it, and I thought, okay, I was listening to another audiobook that I didn't like. I was like, I'll just put that on. It was such an incredible treat to listen to something that I had already read because I wasn't listening to find out what was going to happen. I was listening to understand how he had written this brilliant book. And I could see the structure. It was an incredible experience.
And it really is a brilliant book. Folks, if you have not read Now Is Not the Time to Panic, please do yourselves a favor. Please go get it. It's in paperback. It's
all of Kevin's books. Nothing to see here. And my favorite of his books, Baby, You're Gonna Be Mine.
Oh, yeah. I can
his
see
collection
that.
of stories.
Yeah, I can see that. I can see that. There's so much good writing out there. There are folks in the audience, too, wondering who some of your literary influences are. So I'm going to take this chance and segue for a second. Obviously, Our Town, a big piece of it. But who else have you been excited about over time, and who's part of, how we got here?
It's a very specific question, because the people that I have been influenced by are not, it's not about loving the work. It's about when you read the work.
Yep.
And so I feel like my two biggest literary influences were John Updike and Philip Roth, because those were the writers that I read when I was in high school and college and graduate school. Those were the writers that my parents read. Those were the books around the house, Saul Bellow. Those were the guys I grew up with. And so I can tell you, I adore Colson Whitehead, Zadie Smith, Elizabeth Strout, who is somebody I really want to write like Liz Strout, Louise Erdrich. Just there are people that I love, and I read and read and read everything. The first time I can get my hands on the galleys of any of those people, I'm going to read every single one of their books. It doesn't mean that they've influenced me, because I am old. And you get to a point where it's hard to be influenced. I'll tell you a book that I just read that absolutely rocked my world. Monsters, A Fan's Dilemma by
Claire Detter.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Whoa.
Yeah.
I mean, and that was, she had this influence on me that I thought, like, I haven't seen this before. I haven't seen somebody writing like this before.
Yeah.
And the other person I feel that way about, Hanif Abdurraqib.
Love the basketball memoir, basketball memoir that's coming in March. Oh, Va Boom. That memoir is.
I haven't read that yet.
It's coming. I'm sure it is in a box in a room in front of me.
What's it called?
I don't have it in front of me.
I'll find it.
I'll remember the name.
It is PRH. It's definitely PRH. It's same editor as the last book, and it is a jacket that will just knock your socks off.
He's
actually, Shannon, if you can Google it, that would be
great. He's teaching me how to write differently, how to think differently. Because when I read A Little Devil, and I just thought, I didn't know this was one of the options.
And he flips between poetry and prose, but the way he writes about music, especially, he's changed the way that I think about sound.
Yes.
And how I listen.
Yes.
It really, it's wild because he's done it actually on the page. I mean, he also does podcasts and does lots of interviews and whatnot, but at the same time, he has, with writing on the page, changed the way that I think about sound. And that, it makes my eyes really get big thinking about it.
Okay, but see, now that's influence.
Right.
Exactly. That's something that is completely different from, I read this book and I adored it.
Yes.
That is, I read this book and it changed the way I think about music, about literature, about what's possible, about what I can do. And that's Claire did that. Hanif did that.
Yep. No.
Hanif, just so everyone knows, I dropped the link in the chat, but it's There's Always This Year, and it's on basketball and Ascension, and it's March of next year. So we've got time, but
March of next year feels like tomorrow, Shannon.
Well, and March of next year is when all of these unbelievable books, that's when Percival James is coming out.
Which fabulous. And I did, after you and I spoke, it went to the top of wow. Just wow.
I mean, okay,
just
there's another one.
So much wow
There's another one that I think, all right, that book changed who I am. That book influenced me. Nell Freudenberger is a friend of mine, and she has a book coming out. And I said, "What's your pub date?" And it was the same day that Percival's pub date.
Oh, wow.
And I said, change it, because that book is just going to burn everything down. And she moved to April.
Oh, good. Okay. That just made my life slightly easier too. Before I let all of us go, though, we have a couple of questions about Duke. And I know I've sort of been dancing around Duke a little bit. I like him as a character. I think he is exactly who he needs to be. There was no way that guy was going to have a happy ending. I love the way that Laura sort of sees her orbit with him. I liked that last moment they had when he was, getting his act maybe together, maybe not. And I do love the way the girls related to Duke, and Joe's kind of like, yeah, that guy, whatever. Which I appreciate that guy, whatever. But Duke, I mean, he takes up a lot of air in the room, and we needed him to sort of be the ignition, right? In some ways, like, I mean, he does kick off a lot of this. Yeah.
Dare I say?
I mean, he's a lot, but let's just talk about Duke for a second. Where did he come from? He sort of had to be who he was going to be. I mean,
every guy I dated in my 20s, and every guy I didn't date in my 20s, and every guy my friends dated. I mean, that was just the guy. That was completely. Guy. He suffered. He was brilliant, and he smoked, and he drank, and he was lonely in the bar at 1:00 in the morning reading poetry. And he walked home in the snow under the streetlights, and he suffered. And I could help him. I could ease his suffering because I understood who he was, and he was deep and beautiful. And I'm so glad I'm not spending my life. But, I've had a couple of young women come up to me in signing lines, especially in Mississippi, and say to me, why? She's so smart. She was so great. Why did she go with that guy? He was such a jerk. And I said, there are two kinds of women in this world. Those who are like, oh, Duke, yeah, I get that. And the ones who are like, no, I never did that. And I say, blessings on you that you never did that. Good for you. That's great. The rest of us, we had to do that.
I don't regret my 20s. I made some very questionable choices, but I do not regret a minute of it. I just needed to. I needed to get some stuff out before I settled down and acted like an adult.
Renee just says, oh gosh,
I married that. How are you, Renee?
Sorry.
Heather called out I couldn't stand Duke, but recognized I would have probably liked him in my early 20s, which, yes.
I liked reading about him. I really liked reading about him. I just, you meet these people who have this kind of charisma, right? Like, I think it's happened to a lot of us. No matter how old you just meet that person and you're like, oh, you're kind of fascinating. But are you a train? And then, it's kind of when people show you who they are, believe them.
Oh, yeah. Thank you, Maya Angelou.
Yeah, right. And she was not kidding. She was not kidding.
You asked me, like, what the good scene to write in that book.
Yeah.
That first scene with Duke where he's telling the story of the name of Tom Lake, that was so much fun. That was like, how do you get all of that across where nobody's touching, nobody's doing anything strange? That guy. Like, oh, I know that guy.
It set the stage perfectly for his character. And then him going through, his breakout as the Popcorn King, and then the scene for me actually is one of the last times not the last time, but when they're hooking up in the bathroom and she's realized he's been looking in the mirror
Yeah.
It's 3 sentences, and it's just right on the nose of the reason why she's like, yep,
Yeah.
I can set this off now. Yeah.
Yeah.
I have so much respect for Laura as a character because she's self-aware in a way that isn't punishing. She doesn't yell at herself. She's just kind of like, yeah, I learned a thing. And I really wish that more people, women and men, would, be a little more like oh yeah, I learned a thing.
Yeah,
Oh,
you
I
do.
learned a thing. Because you kind of don't know what you don't know until you know it.
Could not have said it better myself. Yeah.
This is a really generous book. That's one of the things I really appreciate about Tom Lake is that it's really generous towards the characters and not, just in a very real way, in a way that made me feel connected, to your imagination, but also to a world that I'm not part of. I was never a theater kid. I am never in danger, Michigan, I've been to, and it's very pretty, but I'm good, thanks. But I love all of this. There are a couple of people, though, who are wondering why there are not cherry trees or cherry blossoms on the jacket. And I love the story of this jacket because I think this jacket fits the story and the tone and the characters really well. So can we talk about that gorgeous, gorgeous painting that we've used? Because it's beautiful.
So a year ago last May, I was in Paris with my husband and we went to the Orangerie and we turned a corner. I was halfway through writing this book and I saw this painting by Gustave Caillebotte, and it's a giant decorative wall panel. And the blank spot, if you see it in the museum, it's like this. It's at the bottom. And the reason that it's at the bottom and this painting is called Daisy Bed is because it really was just a piece for the wall. And there was going to be a chest of drawers right here. So why bother to paint the daisies? But the empty place felt like a grave to me when I saw it. And I went to the gift shop and I bought some postcards, and I sent one to my editor and one to the head of the art department and said, I haven't finished the book yet, but this is going to be the cover. And then I went back and I put the daisies in the cemetery to match the painting. And
perfect.
It's just the second I saw it and that the beautiful, beautiful bed of daisies and the empty place, I was like, oh, that's it. That's exactly what I mean. Yeah.
It works for me in a way that you don't always get with a jacket. Just saying. Well, this is really, it just swings. It's just beautiful.
I learned an important lesson a long time ago, which is book jackets are like your birthday. And you can say to somebody, oh, get me whatever you like. Or don't get me anything. Don't worry about it. It doesn't work. The only way you get what you want is to figure out what you want, find it, and turn it in. And that's what I do now. You just like, this is the jacket. And as a bookseller, as somebody who spends my whole life looking at book jackets and doing split second what a good jacket and a horrible jacket and a mediocre, forgettable jacket is, I know that I am in charge of getting the good jacket and turning it in.
Yeah. All right. And speaking of jackets, before I let everyone go, if you haven't read Our Town, I'm sorry it's backwards, but this is a really good edition with lots of great supplemental material. This is the one I recommend.
You can also watch it. You can also watch it on YouTube.
Do you have a favorite version? I mean, I know Paul Newman is done. Yeah. Okay. Spalding Gray is the one. Yeah. He's really amazing. There's also Anton Chekhov's plays, collected plays, Cherry Orchard's in here if you want it. And Sam Shepard, we got to shout out the man himself.
There he is.
For Love. Oh. They're two separate volumes. And actually, before I let you go, and I had a very funny conversation quickly with Patricia Gilmore, who's the editor, the book reviewer for the Boston Globe. And her dad was Richard Gilmore, the playwright. And we were talking about Sam Shepard in the context of my interview with you. And she was like, well, my dad wrote an introduction to one of the collected plays. And I said, yes, I know, I own it. It's the other volume.
And that's the other volume too. Yeah. And it's interesting because there's been so much conversation about Our Town and about Chekhov, and nobody mentions Sam Shepard.
I saw True West years ago in New York, and it was John C. Reilly and Philip Seymour Hoffman.
Oh, the one where they switched,
where they were alternating. And I still like when you see Sam Shepard on the stage. I mean, I love reading Sam Shepard, please don't misunderstand me, but when you see the physicality,
yeah,
especially for most of his men don't really have language the way, women might have on the stage. And it is just, if you have a chance, highly recommend. Also, go find the Spalding Gray version of Our Town, because it is spectacular. I will say that it is. Yeah. It's a very different experience from reading it on the page, but Spalding was, he was a cool cat. I'm sorry he's not around anymore. Absolutely. And before we let you go, are you working on something new?
What I'm working on is I'm signing my name.
Okay, fair enough.
And I'm getting so good at it.
Fair enough.
You would believe it. Yeah.
Well, thank you, everyone, for joining us. I know we had so many great questions, but honestly, there's so many more of you than there are of Ann. So we've got to send her back onto the road. So hopefully you'll get a chance to meet her on the road. Thank you again, Shannon. Thank you, Ann. This was great. Really appreciate all of you.
Thank you, Shannon. Thank you.
Thank you.
In Barnes and Noble Land. I'm so grateful.
Have a great afternoon, everyone. Thanks. Bye.